Have either of you considered the possibility of civilizations being much older than what the available evidence suggests? If the hypotheses put forth by people like Graham Hancock are true, and we have had one or more advanced civilizations wiped out either by solar flares or comets or meteors or all of them around 11,000 years ago, where does that leave us? At least in the last 20 years, we've forgotten the universe outside our phones, and it may spell our doom like it probably has done before.
Yeah, lots of thinking. I think your framing is maybe a little off. It's not that civilizations are older, it's that there's a reset that takes relatively advanced civilizations and wipes them out. And this has...
Well, I mean, I read that as there have been advanced civilizations far older than mainstream anthropologists.
Yep, I would say that's fair. I think this is probably, it's strange to say it, but I think it's more likely than not. I think the work on the disaster cycle, 6 and 12,000 years, is robust enough that it raises the question about, do we really think that farming, for example, started since the last reset, or was there farming?
Would have been 2 ago by the periodicity you just mentioned.
Yeah, the 12,000 year. Yeah. But it also raises the possibility that the reset isn't complete, because, of course, any information that persists through one of these resets causes the bootstrapping to be that much faster on the other side.
I think it would be unreasonable to expect that the reset was complete. Why are we so special this time? If there have been regular resets, why did this time we get to a place that, frankly, the evidence of which could not be disappeared by no matter what disaster cycle it was, no matter how global, the evidence of what we have done at this point could not be so fully disappeared. And humans persisted. We know that humans have persisted through, what would it be, hundreds of these disaster cycles. And so some humans persist, and with them some knowledge of what, of human culture persists through each of those bottlenecks.
I mean, I agree that that's likely to be true. I think the degree to which culture is erasable, that, a single generation of not farming wrecks the passage of the subtle knowledge of how to do it. It doesn't take very many generations of not doing it to be left with a cartoon. And in effect, it raises a whole other set of questions, which is many of the things that we technologically do as a modern culture, including writing and art, pass information across space and time in durable ways. So in other words, encoding something in, on a cave wall, in a song that gets passed on because, the nature of songs is such that it preserves the content in a way. That all of those things may be about preserving certain nuggets. The fact that farming is possible obviously greatly accelerates the rate at which it will be discovered, right? If it has to dawn on somebody to plant things, that's a slow process. If you know that there is such a thing called planting, and then the question is, well, how exactly do you do that? You start experimenting and you discover it.
And so you're talking about song as a form of cultural cache. There are, of course, CACHE cache. And, of course, most early farming cultures have traditions of seed saving, of seed caching, of physical caches, that if they are, depending on where they are, and depending on what the disaster is, the discovery of a physical cache could trigger memory as well.
Right, and even just
like, what do I do with this?
Yeah, it raises a question that you might quickly answer. And so it also, you quickly get into a realm where there's so few people responsibly exploring these questions that our understanding of what's real and what isn't is pretty low quality.
And as always, you wonder, so the mainstream anthropology has no truck with Graham Hancock or any of the disaster cycle people. Maybe they're just protecting turf. Maybe they are just protecting turf. But and we know this, that in all fields, the status quo defends the status quo. But this feels like such a adamant, angry, vicious, no holds barred response that is had to the idea of resets, of disaster cycles from mainstream anthropology, that it raises questions for me as to what else they might be protecting. Or is it just the banal human territoriality?
Yeah, I must say, I don't think, yes, it's all of the things you say, but every time there is something important that is breaking through the academic gatekeeping, you see the same vicious response.
Yep.
Anthropology, as you've recently pointed out, was incredibly feeble for decades. And I find the idea that they're protecting something that they understand pretty unlikely. I don't think that there's a lot of understanding going on.
Well, yeah, understanding means a lot of things to a lot of people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we've talked about this a fair bit. I don't know how much we've talked about it on air, but what does it mean that you know something? You ask people that, and often it's revealed pretty quickly that how people understand what it means to know something is wildly different between people.
Yep.
And it explains a lot, I think, about how how a population ends up so easily tricked by people in lab coats, for instance. I know because the expert told me so. That's not knowledge. That's not deep knowledge at any rate. That's thin at best.
Yeah, and I think the conversation that you're alluding to, there are really two branches of the tree of belief, right? There's the branch in which the implications of what you believe are considered evidence, right? If I will be pilloried for believing this, then it's not true. And that's not logically defensible. Right? What will happen to you for believing something has no implication as to whether or not it's true. But nonetheless, it's not surprising to find the vast majority of people highly sensitive and therefore highly manipulable.
Yes, to the social ramifications of knowledge,
right,
or at least of public belief.
So, what you really need is an academy that is totally immunized, that is emboldened to go seek the truth and immunized from social consequences for arriving at inconvenient ones. And we have the opposite. Therefore, it will tell you that which it's allowed to tell you, which will very frequently not only be untrue, but will be the inverse of truth. And we've seen this again and again and again.
Yeah.
And, so we're just in this constant battle with the public, which is, stop believing those people. Really? All the experts are wrong? Mm-hmm. Well, their whole system is designed to be what we would call orthogonal to the truth, right? It is indifferent to the truth. It arrives at conclusions that are valuable to somebody, which does not make them true. Occasionally, their being true makes them valuable. Sometimes obscuring the truth makes them valuable. And in a system where we're paying people to learn how to spot the things that they're supposed to say and then dress them up as science, yeah, of course all of the experts are wrong. It doesn't mean expertise is impossible.
Right.
But it means that in this moment, looking to experts is folly.
Yeah. Just two comments that are relevant here. The Terra Preta, black soils of the Amazon, are interesting. Mm-hmm. I don't remember the details there, but I also remember that there are anomalies in the Amazon that suggest certainly far older civilization than most of what mainstream anthropology suggests. And I remember actually I was thinking about this with regard to reimagining the timeline of people coming across Beringia, that until just a few years ago, you couldn't say anything about it having been anything beyond 8 or 10,000 years ago, without being completely scoffed at. And increasingly now 20, 30, even 40,000 years are numbers that are proposed as when the peopling of the New World began. And given that, the idea that there wouldn't have been civilizations in the Amazon at the point that there were probably civilizations in the Andes and in Mesoamerica would be surprising.
Well, I think in this case, I think we now know that there were massive civilizations, at least one, in the Amazon.
Yeah.
That it was more or less
but we know
completely erased by the fact that all of the materials that it was built out of were organic materials, which are quickly recovered, in a habitat like that. Free resources are picked up by organisms that break them down and use them for something else. But there are images, right? There's like images from on high that allow you to see through the vegetation, that see sort of ghost-like foundations of massive settlements. The disturbance that the settlements made. And I think these soils, if I'm remembering correctly, the soils are the result of intensive agriculture, which is on the one hand surprising because, as you and I have repeatedly pointed out, the poor tropical soils aren't the paradox that they are made out to be. They are the product of intense tropical competition for resources. So all of the resources are in the plants. They're not left sitting around in the soils. But that does mean that farming those soils is not highly productive unless you enrich them, which I think is what these soils are a reflection of.
Yeah. Or you swidden it, right? You move around.
But that's inherently small scale. That's inherently not going to be a big civilization.
Yeah.
So the enrichment, which the Maya also did, and the Inca did. So it may be all of the Mesoamerican civilizations in
New World.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you have to, in order for there to have been a big culture in the Amazon, which is in part why it wasn't spotted. Not only are there no artifacts because it wasn't a stone-based culture, but
and very little is going to fossilize in wet, oxygen-rich conditions.
Yeah, like effectively nothing.
Yeah.
But disturbance, in fact, it's a strange echo of the process that creates a true fossil. You have a bone, it gets buried, then there is a process, a geological process, by which rock is formed, but the fact that there was a substrate of bone causes the chemistry of the rock formation to be a little different, so you can see the bone even after the bone is gone. That's the same thing here. You got disturbance, agricultural disturbance in the Amazon that leaves an imprint which tells you what, the shape of the disturbance. It's not the objects, it's not the materials in question, but it's how the materials were laid down differentially based on trenches and whatever else was created.
Yeah. And the other comment I wanted to pick up on this topic before we move on to the next question. Mainstream figures like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson push impact theory that meteors are the cause for the end of civilizations, but they never mention the geomagnetic excursion that we are living through, and which there is evidence is cyclic and reliable, imprecise, but seems like seems to have a lot of support for it.
And I don't want to get into a battle between these various camps, but I think the evidence for a geomagnetic excursion is, the excursion is clear. The extrapolation to what it will do, meaning that the magnetic pole is moving around relative to the The axis of rotation.
To the point of the pole out of which comes the axis of rotation. Like there's a different word for the North Pole, which is where the axis of rotation comes out, and I can't think of what it is.
Well, there's magnetic north and there's geographic north.
So geographic is a word that I could use there.
Yep.
But the excursion just refers to the magnetic pole moving around potentially quite a lot. And this is different from, but related to, the idea of pole shifts, pole flips.
Yes, I mean, in fact, that's the question. Is absent the excursion being the lead up to a pole flip, what is a pole flip and why does it happen? And the only credible hypothesis I've encountered has to do with this electromagnetic sheet that the solar system is moving through, that basically pulls on all of the magnetic entities in the solar system. And at the point that you cross, not its meridian, but you cross imagine a sine wave, you're crossing through the sine wave, the direction it's pulling on the Earth's magnetic field reverses.
Yeah.
And anyway,
what effect does that have?
There's so much evidence pointing in this direction that I think it's just irresponsible not to include it at least as a major hypothesis for the excursion we're seeing, if not...
For the excursion we're seeing, and for a certain number of the globally changing events that are almost exclusively being attributed to anthropogenic sources of carbon, right?
Yeah, of climate change. And I will point out, I don't know where this stands now. I should ask Ben, but a year or so ago, when I was brushing up on this topic to give a presentation, we had evidence from the sun, and it was either, depending on whether you count Pluto, it was either 8 of 9 solar system planets or 7 of 8 for events, anomalous events consistent with a solar system level shift. And the one planet that we didn't have evidence for, it wasn't that the evidence went against, it was just that there was no data. Mm-hmm. So anyway, what's going on is solar system wide. This has nothing to do with humans and carbon. This has to do...
Well, the geomagnetic excursion is consistent with events that are going on at the level of the solar system.
Yep.
That does not prove that all of the things we're seeing on Earth have nothing to do with anthropogenic sources of changes
climate change
the carbon cycle.
Climate change could be true in addition, anthropogenic climate change. Right. But the fact that you have a solar system level phenomenon that you are not asking, well, okay, the composite of anthropogenic climate change and solar system level shifts is resulting in a certain amount of change down here on Earth.
Yep.
Right? Anthropogenic climate change could be anywhere from 0% to all of it.
Yep.
So the question should be, how much is it accounting for?
Yes.
And we don't ask that question because basically we treat the solar system level event as a non-entity.
It's reprehensible, and it's disgustingly revealing about the state of science.
Right. And I would
and
point
public
out,
policy.
as I've argued in several different places, there's a reason to bias in the direction of it's anthropogenic, which is that it justifies tyranny, right? To the extent that we are in big trouble, but it's not our fault. It's the result of where we are in history and the position of the solar system relative to this electromagnetic sheet. That's a reason for humanity to pull together. It's not a reason to lock us down into 15-minute cities and get us onto central bank digital currencies that allow us to have rewards and punishments for, limiting our carbon footprint or whatever they're going to do to us.
Yep.
So, is that an accident that they've biased in the direction of the hypothesis that justifies tyranny, or are they incentivized to? And, at one level, it doesn't matter. And at another level, if you see it coming, I sure don't like the idea that They want more power on the basis that it's our activity that's the problem. That's A, not supported by the evidence, and B, a little too convenient.
Yeah. But, I mean, you're not advocating for putting all those nice climate scientists out of work, are you?
Immediately. I mean, I would like some climate scientists, but the problem is if you've been on board
Oh, they're so nice.
with the conventional narrative and you haven't raised questions about where it's overdrawn, then you're part of the problem, because
Yep.
in an environment where you're effectively not allowed to publish countervailing evidence, we have no way of calibrating what we know. It can all be fiction because all you know is that whatever data would point in the direction of it's not being an issue hasn't been seen.